It is officially witching hour. Six people six people requested this video. So if you're one of them, thank you. And this is for you and everyone else, to be honest. I don't only want 6 people to watch this video. Needless to say, witches appear in everything from kids' films to teen TV to high fantasy to comedy, but as is in the name, I'll be mostly focusing on horror movies. Emphasis on mostly. And within this genre, there are some interesting patterns and categories that pop up. As with almost all monsters and creatures of fiction, there's always the interpretation of them as normal-looking people. There are lots of reasons that witches are costumed like this in film. Sometimes it's about deceiving others, sometimes it's blending in or becoming human, sometimes it's the filmmakers destigmatizing the archetype. And this normal interpretation also includes what I'm calling the domestic witch, an archetype that emerged in the 60s, rooted in positive perceptions of domestic women that allowed us to morally root for witches as protagonists. While the design of everyday wear and domestic witches can be filled with symbolism and nuance, I'm going to put those costumes aside. We are going to go through purge witches, hags, black and white witches and teen outcasts, and then look at some standout costumes that didn't fall into an obvious category. And as with all of my videos, this is based on a combination of research and my own analysis. I will link all of my sources if you want to read up on any of it yourself. I put a huge amount of effort into this video, so if you could also do me the good graces of liking it, it helps YouTube put it in front of more people, and it helps me with my ever-developing God complex. Before we get into our specific categories, let's start with the common denominators that define the witch. There are 3 common items that we might associate with the on-screen witch: the broomstick, the hat, and the cloak. These items crop up as early as 1922's Hexen, the first witch horror movie, and their pre-screen origins could be a 3-hour video on its own, but here's the most basic rundown. What's commonly considered to be the first association between witches and broomsticks is a 1435 transcript where a priest called William Edeline was tortured into confessing that he had flown to meet the devil on a broom. I really keep forgetting this isn't a microphone, and it's just a prop wand. My bones today, man. Clickety clack. And the first known image is this 1440s illustration in Les Champions des Dames by Martin Lefranc. However, we have little information on why or how this really became synonymous with witchcraft beyond these examples. And the origins of the hat are even muddier. People have worn conical hats at least as far back as the Bronze Age. Mummified remains of women in China from around 300 BC have been discovered in tall pointed hats. Some historians cite potentially anti-Semitic roots with the Juden hat that was worn to distinguish Jews from Christians, and at a point was something that Jews were forced to wear. To me, Quaker hats of the 17th century stand out as the most similar visually, and they would have been seen here or there in the UK and the US, although Quakerism was never a dominant religious group, so the items would have been recognizable but not super common. Late 1800s historian Amelia Montgomery claimed in her book The Quaker, A Study in Costume that women preaching the Quaker religion in 1600s had been accused of witchcraft, and preaching women would always wear the conical hat. Thus, their little hats became a part of witch history. Then suddenly we have multiple images from the 1700s onwards that show witches in what we now know as the classic witch hat. And from here, this is translated into fictional illustrations and plays and so on and so forth until we got movies, baby. As for cloaks, to keep this quick, people wore them in ye olde times. So for plenty of centuries, this was just a normal item of clothing. But as cloaks are no longer normal, this is a good way in costuming to signal that someone is part of an old world or old tradition. They also shield the wearer and help them conceal their identity when needed. So given that witches are often up to nefarious biz, a cloak helps them go unnoticed when doing so. Evolving from this, cloaks can also do the opposite and draw attention, bringing a dramatic or regal flair to an outfit. The Grand High Witch in The Witches is a great example of this. Her cloak, which is actually a very slay reveal down into a train when she lets go of it, emphasizes her zest for glamour and drama. All of that said, even though we often think of these items as witch iconography, I think that's because it mostly appears in children's media. In some ways, I think it's too simplistic or cartoonish to appeal to dramatic and horrific sensibilities. We have finally made it to the first category, witches of the purges. One major witch costume trope is the medieval or Renaissance period witch, and not the Carrie kind of period witch. The purges took place during the crossover of the medieval and Renaissance periods from 1400 to 1775 AD. The accuracy of our understanding of the purges and of real-world witch accusations is wobbly to say the least. There is a lot of misinformation that surrounds this time period because we don't have the amount of historical documentation that it would take to build a fully fleshed out picture of the time. But we do know, regardless of specific numbers or what this persecution actually looked like, that normal women in a variety of roles in society were accused of witchcraft. So ultimately, purge witch costumes are based on real, normal clothing items worn by women at this time. Dresses, blouses, and skirts. While people in the Middle Ages did have colourful clothes, brightly coloured dyes were rare and expensive. And as many purge witch films focus on peasant women, we see pretty neutral colour palettes for their costumes. Undyed fabric was more likely to be beige or grey, and cheaply dyed fabrics might have been brown, red, or yellow. We also see bonnets crop up quite often in these movies, as they were worn by working women to keep their hair free of dirt and dust. In the medieval period, uncovered hair might actually have been a sign that someone was a virgin, but we've since developed a cultural association between bonnets and modesty, as many religions, including Western religions, require women to cover their hair. I think because of this, they're often used in witch costumes to show a character's compliance or innocence, sometimes a way to disguise their true nature, and sometimes to reflect it. For instance, and spoilers ahead for Robert Eggers' The Witch, Thomasin wears a bonnet for a large portion of that film, even when she's under suspicion of being a witch. And it's not until she actually embraces the devil that her long hair comes down. Free of modesty and shame and society's confinement, she can finally be herself. We've been seeing this roughly historically accurate costume type for as long as witches have been on screen. The earliest example being 1922's Hexen, which is set for the majority in 1488. They've also cropped up in more modern fare like the aforementioned The Witch, The Crucible, Hagazusa, and plenty in between. Interestingly, I think films from the 1970s seem the least interested in historical accuracy, and often combined elements of 70s fashion with what are supposed to be medieval outfits. But 70s trends like long flowing skirts, peasants' blouses, and warm neutral colour palettes actually fit fairly well into a purge witch setting. My best friend once said to me that I was born a hag. While he was talking about the crazed confidant of a queer man, of course here I'm using the term hag to refer to old and often unattractive female witches. At least I hope that's not also what he meant. The hag's appearance is sometimes taken into horrific territory, and sometimes it's simply reflecting the realities of age, which we'd all be a little more comfortable with if magazines stopped using Photoshop and this carousel of Caucasian actresses stopped getting Botox. There is a suggestion, refuted by some contemporary historians, that older women who dabbled in medicinal remedies and lived in isolation were feared by their communities. And this misunderstanding has definitely shaped our depiction of witches in media, associating old, isolated women with witchcraft. But when it comes specifically to on-screen witches, I think that the untrue association between physical ugliness and evil, something observed in a multitude of studies, plays a huge role. Not to mention the anti-Semitic roots of demonizing certain features. Making a character unattractive is a very easy way to communicate to both kids and adults swayed by a lifetime of beauty standards that they are a morally bad person. As someone with thin, villainous lips, I have oft struggled with this association. In the words of Glinda the Good Witch,
"Only bad witches are ugly."
This brings me to our first and undoubtedly one of the most recognisable on-screen hags, the Wizard of Oz's Wicked Witch of the West. And what is it that stands out most about the Wicked Witch of the West? Her sickly green skin, something that has continued since this appearance in 1939 to crop up in witch media, especially in cartoons and children's media. As far as I could tell, this is the first appearance of a green witch in cinema, although not the origin of green-skinned witches full stop, as there had been earlier green witches in folklore tales, like Jenny Greenteeth in Britain. And the Wicked Witch's skin colour isn't actually mentioned in the Wizard of Oz novel, but MGM wanted to take advantage of the fact that the film was being shot in Technicolor and apparently encouraged all departments working on the film to make the most of this. So the costume department said, make this whole green. And why not red or purple? Some historians believe green to be associated with the devil, possibly as green blends in with nature and allows evil to be hidden in plain sight. There's also a chance it stems from human skin turning green as a sign of sickness, and sickness having been associated with evil or demonic embodiment before we had a modern understanding of medicine. You probably know this, but Dorothy's sparkly red shoes, formerly owned by the Witch of the East, were also changed from silver in the book to red in the film as the colour worked better on screen. The Wicked Witch's costume itself, despite looking densely black in motion, is actually really beautiful with plenty of detail. Unfortunately, no one knows where the costume ended up, so we don't have any high-res images of it. But one thing we can see clearly from the 1939 footage is the silhouette. Her dress features a skirt, cape, puffed sleeve, and slack corset. The sleeve could be drawing from an 1890s lamb of mutton sleeve, or it may be making reference to the puff and pain or slashed sleeve from Tudor England, which pops up a lot in fairy tale design. If you look at this from the Victorian angle, an outfit could be viewed as representing an uptight, archaic society a la the Victorians. And this kind of cruel adult attitude is something Dorothy fears. For many hags, their costume plays second fiddle to their face. In dark, shapeless outfits, sometimes as simple as a black cloak, leaving her other features to communicate the inner horrors. Sometimes hag costumes are simple for functional reasons. The first witch we see in 1922's Hexen is an older woman wearing a very simple hooded cloak and unfussy dress. The costume's priority is not projecting an idea of herself to others. It's not saying much at all, because its function is simply to keep her warm and comfortable in her underground home where she sits, works, and cooks alone. Shawls and blankets are frequently used to clothe hags because they are items of clothing actually worn by older women to ward off the cold, and sometimes younger women, sometimes me. While her face might be frightening, these costumes can help create the idea that the hag is unassuming and harmless. But is she harmless? This brings us to hags with dual identities that are extreme opposites. Story dependent, she switches beautiful and glamorous to ugly and unassuming. The most obvious example of this is Snow White, but I want to skip over the Disney classic and jump to 1997's Snow White: A Tale of Terror, starring Sigourney Weaver as the Wicked Queen. This film has fabulous costumes, but unfortunately, because the film itself is a bit of a mess, I feel like they don't get their dues. Justice for costume designer Merritt Allen, who also, fun fact, so many fun facts, costumed the witches. Weaver's character, Claudia, the witch/queen in this story, wears a lot of yellow and even baby blues, colours we don't usually associate with evil, perhaps the furthest from it. These light colours tend to be when she's in public, when she's in front of the King Frederick. They're showing us how she wants to be perceived by others. But the light palette devolves into darkness as the runtime goes on. When she transforms into full hagdom, we get a very classic dark and shapeless hag costume, but executed exquisitely. The fabric itself echoes the intricacies of her glamorous evil queen costumes, having a mix of detailed patterns. There are at least 4 different patterns in this costume, and it adds so much more depth than a simple block grey or brown. It might immediately strike you, as it did for me, that the design of Claudia as the hag has similarities to the painting The Ugly Duchess. And I wonder if this painting was a legitimate inspiration for Alan, because the fabric of Claudia's sleeve also has similarities to the fabric on the Duchess's headpiece. The shape of the headpiece, called an escoffion, is also mirrored. This style was worn by women in the late Middle Ages, and in Claudia's costume, the shape has been altered to more closely resemble devil's horns. Her escoffion is created from a hollow lattice rather than a plush fabric. Instead of a piece of flowing chiffon, there's a stringy, frail cloth draped over top that almost looks like a cobweb. All of this adds to the worn and haggard look of the headpiece, the haggard look of the overall outfit, the haggard look. See what I did there? Hi cuties, it's me from editing. I just wanted to give a quick in memoriam to my makeup in this next section because it looks absolutely horrible, which I didn't discover until I started editing it. It was supposed to be like a cute little 60s thing, and this is complete vanity to even give you this warning. I just want you to know that I know I look bad. Rather like the hag, witches in black are an instantly recognisable cinematic interpretation of the witch. And why black? Well, black is associated with Satanism, by way of Satanism being the antithesis of Christianity, albeit an antithesis that acknowledges Christian religion, as Satan himself is a biblical figure. And if God is light, as John 1:5 tells us, then Satan is the darkness. Black is the absence of light, and therefore black becomes representative of evil. Outside of religion, there's also the idea of black and white magic, which basically dictates that black is magic done with evil intent, and white magic is when witchcraft is used for good, which again results in the colour black being associated with evil, and in turn the colour white associated with goodness. Rather like vampires, black costumes allow witches to blend in with the darkness, both physically and metaphorically. They allude to witches' evil engagements or behaviours. A really straightforward example of this is Asa, the vengeful witch from Black Sunday. Black Sunday is a 1960 American horror very loosely based on Russian novella Vi, in which Barbara Steele plays 2 characters, including the 1600s witch Asevada, who was sentenced to death by her town and comes back in the 1800s to shake things up. It is a black and white film, and I couldn't find an archive of the costumes now, so technically we don't actually know what colours they may have been, but as it appears on screen, Asa wears a pretty simple black cloak for the majority of the runtime. And she looks totally period inaccurate, with a half up, half down beehive and winged liner with a white waterline. Things that reflect the fashion of the late 1950s when the film was made. In contrast, Katia, the innocent young woman who is also played by Steele, wears much more white throughout the film. The clear link between the colour black and evil has been blurred as the character traits of the witch evolved, meaning often black costumes set the stage for subversion. Morticia is a great example of this. She is a looming figure dressed in all black, and we might expect her to be evil, but really she is a loving mother and wife. And if anyone is debating if Morticia is a witch, she is. I confirmed this. It is established in episode 5 of the 1964 TV show. Morticia started life as a character in the 1938 comic, The Addams Family. And from the very beginning, she has worn the same full-length, slinky black gown with a deep plunging neckline and ragged hemline, which almost makes it look as if she has tentacles. In the 1991 movie The Addams Family, Morticia's iconic costume is actually many gowns. Costume designer Ruth Myers designed over 20 dresses for Morticia, as she saw the Addams family as aristocratic in nature, and wearing a variety of outfits each day showed their wealth. These outfits transition seamlessly as they all share the same colour and silhouette. And the consistent overall look of the costumes is a nice play on Morticia's comic strip origins, as she was only ever drawn in one recognisable outfit like most cartoon characters. Myers wanted Morticia to look like an otherworldly being who swept across the room. Rather than go with something stiff and exaggerated, Morticia's dresses feature wispy tendrils of fabric around the sleeve and hem in lace and beading. She feels discreetly opulent. Moving to a more recent example, American Horror Story Coven sees almost all its core cast sporting all-black attire. When you're clothing so many characters in the same monochromatic black, in some ways it stops signaling their nature. It simply puts them in a group, indicates they share one key feature or status. It's other nuances of the costume, like fine tailoring, flashy furs, and Peter Pan collars, that define who they are as individuals. I consider myself to have somewhat of a personal connection with Coven, as it blew up in 2014 when I was 18 or 19, in perfect sync with contemporary trends, as the outfits were built out of widely available street fashion of the time. We saw lots of flowing maxi skirts, mesh cutouts, and wide-brimmed hats, which are a lovely subversion of the pointed witch hats, and probably the best thing that they did with their costumes. It was all very Coachella, but make it goth, and anyone could mimic it by walking into a high street shop. And boy, did we. Right now, 2014 fashion is probably upheld as the epitome of bad taste. And I can't deny that I myself am still bending to the whim of the trend cycle, because I find myself so adverse to the costumes in this show. I really don't like them. But undoubtedly, we will come back round to many of these trends, and we'll all be wearing chokers and fedoras again someday soon, because that is how the cycle works. Where there is dark, there is light. And this gives us the White Witch. And no, I'm not talking about Tilda Swinton in Questionable Dreads, although to give it credit, the costuming in both of the Narnia adaptations is pretty amazing. Here I'm talking about the white floaty dress worn by the fledgling witch. You'll see the white gown appear in this form in many witch films, but mostly pre-1900 witch films. And I see their origins as partly practical, as white dresses and slips have throughout much of history been worn as undergarments and nightgowns. When we get purge films where women are tried for witchcraft, we often see them being stripped of the clothing items that show their rank or modesty and left in the white underdress. To be left in a white undergarment was a way of degrading a woman or witch being tried and tortured without literally dragging them naked through the street, and without having to give your film an R18 rating. In some films, witches are costumed in white gowns not because they have been forced into wearing them, but because they are nighties or burial dresses. V, 1967, also based on the Russian novella of the same name, features the witch Panochka. She dies and is entombed wearing a white flowing burial gown and flower crown. Panochka isn't really good or evil, but we know that she tried and failed to seduce two men in the story, and as flower crowns have been traditionally worn by unmarried women in Russia and the Ukraine as a symbol of their purity, I wonder if the choice of flower crown is symbolic that she is a virgin. I will say it is also possible that it's traditional in Russia to bury people in flower crowns, but if that is true, I couldn't find anything that backed that idea up. We see this same combination of flower crown and white dress in the 1971 British folk horror film Blood on Satan's Claw. Set in the 1700s, it features teenage devil worshipper Angel. And this hoe is evil. There is no question about this. So innocence, her white attire, does not represent. In her first appearance, she's in a white slip with beige corset and skirt. It's unassuming and soft. But what stood out to me is that more so than other characters, you can see her cleavage, even though she's only a teenager. Angel walks this uncomfortable line as a child seductress, manipulating both adults and other children. The only other character we see in a cleavage-revealing costume is the other young blonde Satan worshipper. It's a subtle way at hinting that these two girls are devious, because as we all know, sex is evil. We see Angel in another scene sporting a white slip when she's seducing her teacher before showing herself naked to him. There is this weird tension between her childish, innocent look and sexual presence. And across horror cinema, witches were heavily sexualized, particularly in the 70s, and often depicted nude. You could pin this down to a witch's rejection of societal norms, wanting to make people uncomfortable, whether that be people in the film or for the audience watching. It could also tap into a witch's connection to nature, a stand-in for the spiritual world, where the city and money and clothes represent earthly things, and nudity represents a level of transcendence. But for the most part, I think the way that a lot of nude scenes of witches are shot in these movies are pretty objectifying and unnecessary, which leads me to conclude that many of these directors were probably just most interested in the simple pleasures of sexualizing the female body. Back to Blood on Satan's Claw, Angel's most recognizable look, a wide, shapeless garment with almost zero detail, isn't worn until the latter half of the film. At this point, she has gone full cult leader. She is Jared Leto in all of the worst ways. The dress no longer looks like an undergarment as in the previous scene, but a purpose-built white robe, like something she made herself out of a sheet or simple white fabric. Perhaps its unfussy nature is showing us that Angel has put away earthly desires. Perhaps it's to remind us of Jesus, who is often pictured in clothing like this. Or it may be to remind us of an angel, like her namesake. The flower crown plays a dual role in furthering her resemblance to Jesus in his crown of thorns, and also signifying her connection to the devil. I mentioned when I was talking about Wizard of Oz that throughout history, the colour green and nature have been connected to Satan and his buddies. Nature as an entity or god is also a significant part of various pagan religions. So the non-Christian implications of her thorned flower crown are vivid. Also, I know characters have to wear something, they have to wear a colour, and it's not always a choice. So this may be way too over-analytical, but it really did stand out to me that the most evil boy in the film wears a full deep green outfit and literally first appears skulking around in the wood. Truly like evil hiding in plain sight. Lastly, on Angel, she wears comically dark and exaggerated makeup, arched eyebrows, and bright red circular cheeks. Rather than actually beautify herself with makeup, it's a perversion of beauty and purity, like the coned breasts on the statue of Mary in The Exorcist. She's a defiled angel, literally. So as simple as the costume looks, it actually tells us so much about Angel Blake. And I did not expect myself to get so passionate about a white sheet. The costumes in 1996's The Craft have become super iconic and influential for goth and alternative people ever since its release. Their costumes are not actually that extreme, aside from a few of Nancy's, in a way that almost feels like a bit of a Mandela effect, at least for me anyway. I remember them quite differently. And maybe that's because what they wear isn't actually that out there or alternative compared to what most people wear today, at least in my city anyway. Like literally everyone in Te Whanganui Atada dresses like this. But their outfits definitely stand out among their peers in the film. I'd argue that creating the look of an outcast was something that was easier to do in the 90s because there was a much more singular idea of mainstream cool. Everyone was seeing the same TV shows, the same magazines, buying their clothes from the same catalogues, and if you wanted to be different, you had to more actively seek it. Whereas nowadays we stumble so easily into different social worlds and cultural groups and aesthetics because it's all available to us all the time online. And we'll see it whether we go looking for it or not. And suddenly subculture is less hidden and therefore less shocking. To not put it gently at all, they really fucked this up in The Craft 2020 because these girls don't look like outcasts at all. Like, you're telling me that these 4 hot, well-dressed people aren't considered cool? One element of the 90s film that both restricts and influences their costumes is that they're at school. And yes, they're at school in both versions, but here the school at least appears to have a uniform. And because of this, many of their outfits roughly keep to a school uniform structure, with white tops, dark bottoms, blazers, skirts, polos and cardis, and in navy instead of black. Especially for Nancy, these are her most normal costumes, with only her hair and makeup taking it into goth territory. Nancy is definitely the costume standout of The Craft, being dressed in distinct pieces that align with punk and goth subcultures of the 90s, like her spiked chokers, cross motifs, boxy leather blazers, and billowing black dresses. Or billowing black dress. She wears mostly black, but interestingly, when the girls befriend Sarah and we're supposed to like her the most, she wears more white. Then when the girls turn on Sarah, they're all dressed in almost completely black, bar Nancy's school skirt. The subtle inclusion of the school skirt is a really nice detail in this costume, as it reminds us, even subconsciously, that these girls are teenagers first and foremost. The other girls, while still clearly outcasts, don't wear the same trad goth attire as Nancy, leaning more into 90s grunge, beatnik, and whimsy goth. Particularly Rochelle being costumed this way was actually pretty significant at the time, and in many ways still is today. While the character isn't handled perfectly, she's a departure from the stereotype of black witches being wise women in caftans who get 5 minutes of screen time, as she's involved with the same pagan witchcraft as the other teenage girls. And this, in many ways, is considered to have paved the way for other teen black witches in TV and film. It should be said, though, that actress Rachel True was not involved in much of the marketing and advertising for this film, which kind of tells you what the studio really thought or cared about. One other example of a teen outcast that I'm very fond of and want to talk about is Lena from 2013's Beautiful Creatures. In this film set in South Carolina, the location changes what it means to look like an outcast. Lena wears a lot of earthy colours and floaty blouses and skirts in lace and microflorals. She looks so hilariously normal, and the fact that she looks slightly arty is enough to make her an outcast. When her peers are wearing bright colours and 50s silhouettes, they look like they belong on a postcard in a diner, another reminder that their way of life and way of thinking might be a little bit behind the times. Costume designer Jeffrey Kurland said, "Lena doesn't want to be any different from anyone else, yet she is." And her costumes do a great job of communicating this. Kurland doesn't take her to a visual extreme because she's not an anarchist. She's not trying to make a statement. She's just existing, to the chagrin of her good Christian neighbours. I also love Lena's costume in the climax so much. In the scene, she's effectively choosing between being a good witch and a bad witch, and Kurland said that with this choice between light and dark in mind, he went with grey for her dress to show that she was in between. While not a teen outcast, but definitely still an outcast, Emmy Rossum's character, another witch in the film, has some wicked costumes. The wickedly talented. Her style has clear gothic and screen siren influences, and she's much more sexed up to really show that she is the antithesis of the conservative townsfolk. Townsfolk sounds so old-timey. It's set in like 2010. With those categories out of the way, we're now going to move on to talking about some specific costumes that didn't fit into other particular categories. And I do have to give a PSA because I know some people will be like, why didn't you talk about this? I'm not going to talk about the Love Witch. And that's only because I just didn't find my personal analysis was flowing when I researched Elaine's costumes. But I do want to highlight the fact that director Anna Biller literally made the costumes by hand. Everything was either vintage or made by her, on top of writing, editing, directing, producing, and scoring the music for the film. Should have called it Love Witch Multitask of Madness. Eveline, also known as the Wicked Witch of the West, is the antagonist in Wizard of Oz adaptation, The Wiz, which stars Miss Diana Ross as a 33-year-old, 24-year-old Dorothy, and Michael Jackson as the Scarecrow, who confusingly looks more like the Lion because they decided to give him a facial prosthetic, but I digress. Eveline herself was played by actress and singer Mabel King, also in prosthetics, and that's actually where I want to start breaking down this otherwise amazing costume. It has to be noted that rather like Glinda and Elphaba in The Wizard of Oz, the difference in Eveline and Glinda the Good's appearances rely on some ugly real-life stereotypes. The Good Witch here is a slim, light-skinned black woman, while Eveline is a large, darker-skinned black woman with a wide prosthetic nose. Eveline is the opposite of Eurocentric beauty. And while costume designer Tony Walton did an otherwise amazing job, it is likely more than coincidental that as a white costume designer working with black actresses, that these decisions were grounded, even if subconsciously, in the belief that these traits were undesirable, even monstrous. But moving to the positives, her dress itself is a work of art and one of my favorite costumes actually in this whole video. In this Library of Congress interview, the costume designer Tony Walton discussed the idea of the Winkies being oppressed, shown in their many layers of clothing, and that Eveline's costume needed to show that she was their leader, which results in this huge, heavy, layered outfit. The level of detail here is incredible. It really reminds me of Mr. Oogie Boogie from The Nightmare Before Christmas. Oh my god, I just said Christmas! Have yourself a very Merry Christmas. I'll be home for Christmas. It really reminds me of Mr. Oogie Boogie from The Nightmare Before Christmas because it has this similar quality of almost looking like it's made up of little worms and creatures. The dress is an accumulation of evil shapes and colors that appear like organs, little faces and creatures, all mashed together in a gory but glamorous fantasy. The dress also has the appearance of something decaying, bubbling, bleeding, the red like blood and yellow like pus. But there is a less disgusting interpretation, as Walton's original design sketches make the items attached to the dress feel much less organic and almost more metallic and mechanical, like a crazy old grandma wandering around the house picking up random cogs and needles and coins. Walton referenced the work of artist Alfonso A. Osorio as a core inspiration for Eveline's dress, which is very clear when comparing the works. Osorio's collages in particular have the same effect of feeling both organic and inorganic at the same time. Walton bizarrely doesn't actually mention his name in this interview, but I think it's pretty obvious that this is the artist he was discussing. And in terms of its actual construction, it's surprisingly juvenile. According to Walton, it was too expensive to use jewels and fine materials, so they used cut-up dog toys instead. But the dense amount of detail, whether it's plastic toys, embroidery, beading, or whatever else they may have used within each panel of the gown, creates an overall illusion of something much more luxurious. Either way, there's this concept of gathering, consuming, and stashing things that don't belong to her. And I really love that, no matter which way you look at it. And so I'd like to thank my friend Britt for making this incredible jumper, which she gave to me for my birthday. At my birthday party, sucking Suspiria is full of beautiful costumes designed by Giulia Piersanti, including all of the humble but frankly fabulous period-accurate outfits in beige and burgundy. I could probably do a whole video on this stuff alone. The Amish influence on Susie's costumes, Sarah's fashionable slacks that represent her forward-thinking nature, Madame Blanc's billowing costumes, alluding to her perhaps hiding something. But for this video, I just want to discuss one costume, and that is the dance outfit worn by the students in their performance of Volk. The costumes are made up of red rope tied in intricate knots. Piersanti had a few inspirations that led her to this. Firstly, she cites a 1970s performance by the artist Christo, which featured a dress made of ropes attached to a rock. Piersanti said of this, "I liked the way it represented the heavy burden women have to carry," which could be read in two ways in the context of the film. That the dancers have the heavy burden of upholding the school's magic, or more simply, that each dancer is burdened by their own womanhood. Slightly conflicting with this, the choreographer of Suspiria said that the costumes were modelled off of dance outfits he'd used in a previous performance. I couldn't find Piersanti herself mentioning this, but it's very clear that the costumes were inspired by this just by looking at them. Piersanti also referenced photographer Nobuyoshi Araki, whose work features the Japanese bondage technique shibari. Shibari actually originated as a method of torture, but it's evolved into an erotic art. Piersanti said that she bought bondage rope from sex shops and used the shibari technique to knot the ropes into what she called a witchcraft star shape. In the scene, they're casting a spell through dance, and these shapes created by the ropes are not just there to look pretty, but as part of the spell. Like ancient runes that you might find etched into old stone or symbols written with blood on a wall. They all wear the same design, repeating the shape over and over like a visual chant. The sharp lines are also mirrored by these shapes of the lines on the floor that help them with their choreography. Everything within the performance is serving the spell. According to Piersanti, the ropes that hang off the body were left there to emphasize the sharpness of the dancer's movements and also to create the illusion of dripping blood, which, in her words, added to the sense of fear and dread. I was really not born to dance. I also love that they just have these beige granny panties on and pads on their knees because of all the floor work involved with the actual dance. When it comes down to it, they look like real dance costumes, and I think this is what makes them so much stronger than if they were just designed with a look in mind. Marie Laveau is another character in Ryan Murphy's Coven, but unlike the sleigh posse of teens dressed in black, she has a far more interesting and broad spectrum of costumes, as she's based on a real-life New Orleans Creole woman considered the first priestess of American voodoo in the 1800s. The really fascinating thing here is that there were actually two Marie Laveau's, mother and daughter, and their stories have been conflated through history as the daughter took over from the mother's responsibilities later in her life. Original Marie was a healer, herbalist, community activist, and beauty salon owner. And now is probably the time to say, from what I've heard, calling her a witch isn't necessarily accurate, as it's not how practitioners of voodoo refer to themselves, but it's my video. And I want to talk about her. So I am. Today she's a witch. Welcome, Laveau, to the Coven. You may have heard of the magical Negro trope in cinema, which refers to black side characters with spiritual insight or legitimate magic abilities who aid leading white characters. It's a problematic concept that occurred subconsciously in the works of many white directors, most likely rooted in the idea that black people are more inherently connected to the spiritual world, whether that be by Christian faith, hoodoo, voodoo, psychogeography, etc. Where this refers to a black character who performs magic, the trope has resulted in some quite surface-level depictions of voodoo and black witches. Marie Laveau's costumes subvert these flat depictions by giving her a foot in both the past and the present. Coven is set in 2013, and her costumes are for the most part contemporary to this. She's modern, she's sleek, and while we do occasionally see her in the more typical flowing kaftan and head wrap, she doesn't need to only ever be costumed in this to show that she is a practitioner of voodoo. My favourite outfit of hers is this leopard print jumpsuit with red leather jacket and hoop earrings. The vivid colour and busy pattern is a stark contrast to the all-black outfits worn by the Coven. In an 1830s-ish flashback, she wears a black gown and billowing silk shawl nipped in by a belt. This creates a puffed sleeve shape, making the outfit seem much more regal than a simple shawl. It's a lovely detail that instantly makes us see Laveau as more powerful and sophisticated. This costume is also very like the outfit worn by the real Laveau in the most well-known surviving portrait of her. Call this a reach, but I feel like these two outfits mimic each other with the red cover-up, the bangle, the hoop earring, the shape. In general, Laveau's cohesive aesthetic between timelines is created by using a consistent palette of reds, browns, blacks, and oranges. Possibly colours that represent the earthly origins of herbalism, or also not that. Don't ask as to why we're now on the floor. We just are. Is Mary Poppins a witch? Just a thought, just a question. We are on to our final witch, or should I say witches. The Sanderson sisters are the three witches at the heart of the ooky spooky Halloween classic, Hocus Pocus. I have not seen Hocus Pocus, but I knew that I needed to include this because of how important it is to other people, and I didn't want another No Underworld in the Vampire video debacle on my hands. Please remember that I am one person. I haven't seen every movie, and something that might be really obvious to you might not be really obvious to me. Thankfully for all of us though, the Hocus Pocus costume designer Mary Vogt has talked a lot about her design process with the Sandersons. So this is not coming out of my arse, this is coming out of her mouth. Even though Hocus Pocus is a Halloween film, and I think some people do consider it to be a horror, ultimately it is a children's or at least family Disney film. This had a big influence on the costumes, and I say that in the best way. It being a fun family film really gave them the opportunity to go big and bold. They weren't confined by history, reality, or darkness, and according to Vogt, director Kenny Ortega was open to being pretty out there with the Sandersons' outfits. The clearest outcome of this desire to make something fun and bold is in the use of colour, as each Sanderson wears an outfit of deep layered jewel tones. Vogt said that when she discussed her ideas for Winifred's costumes with Ortega, that they couldn't just put industry icon Bette Midler in a plain black witch costume. You have to put her in something that's colourful and fun and has a little sparkle to it, she said. Knowing that Winifred was going to have red hair in the film when Vogt's design process began, she went with green as a contrasting colour, choosing accents of purple. When it came to Mary and Sarah, they were a palette of reds and oranges and pinks and purples. The similarities in the palette keeps Winifred standing out in green as the clear leader of the three witches. Even though the Sandersons were around in 1650s Salem, Vogt went down a more medieval path for their costumes, saying that they were influenced by fairy tales. And given we're not really looking for historical accuracy in a campy fantasy film, I think the choices they made work. You could also argue that as the Sandersons, even back in their day, lived alone in a cottage in the forest and were somewhat isolated from their community, that they probably were dressing differently from everyone else anyway. They always stood out. Winifred's dress features ancient symbols, some of which were taken from the Stonehenge and some from the rune alphabet, but all slightly altered with extra lines and shapes to make sure that they weren't legitimate. Vogt has a comment on this which I think is rather funny, where she said, "Symbols are always tricky to do because you don't want to accidentally use some ancient symbol that's evil." I think this amuses me because I don't actually believe in magic. So the thought of accidentally summoning some evil demon by putting the wrong shapes and lines on Bette Midler's dress in a Disney film is just a surreal and ridiculous concept. For Sarah, Vogt's key influence was a sleeping beauty princess or witch princess, and Mary's look was based on a cook or baker, as she was the one who mixed their potions. Vogt also said that she was inspired by the work of Francisco Goya, particularly his series Los Caprichos. I'm not gonna lie, I do not see it. I don't see the connection between these pieces, but it's an interesting, unexpected influence, and maybe you're able to see something that I'm not, so I thought it was definitely worth mentioning. Witches have taken so many shapes and forms in film, and their costumes serve to show us their true nature, to conceal it, to subvert expectations, and to build upon existing mythology. It's notable that we have so rarely seen androgynous or masculine witches in any period of film. The absence of witches in trousers and blazers and even suspenders and brogues, typically masculine items, tell us how imbued femininity is with the witch. While the pointed hat or broom might be the first thing we think of when it comes to witches, really this research has taught me that it is a dress, a culturally feminine item of clothing that is core to witch iconography. And sure, dresses and skirts are in part so present because women weren't even wearing trousers until the mid-20th century, but it's inadvertently created such a strong link between feminine dress and witches. Maybe, given that this territory is so untouched for witches, masculine and androgynous clothing items are something that we'll see more of in witch costumes of the future. Or perhaps we'll find ourselves bound to the tropes we've already created. Dresses aside, I think the most significant thing that the costumes communicate to us about witches is that they don't care for the opinions of others. Whether it's removing a bonnet, dressing for warmth and comfort, or expressing themselves boldly in spite of their environment, witches dress for themselves. Apart from the witches that have been stripped of their clothes and left in their white nighties. But they don't really fit with the empowered message of self-expression, so I will continue to ignore them. But concerning the rest of them, I think witches have a genuine message to teach us, which is to dress for ourselves. And this is getting very after school special, which is not the direction I wanted to take it in. So thank you so much for watching. Give the video a like if you liked it, and I will see you in a few weeks.